So the next speaker is Daniel Poole, University of Sheffield, United Kingdom, about data sharing in autism research, the views of autistic people and the parents of autistic children.
Hello. Thanks very much. So I'm going to be talking about data. Anyone who was in the last session in here, this is really picking up on some topics raised by Monique Beaufort, looking at research practice and how we might look at improving what we're doing. So open data refers to the research practice of sharing anonymous research data beyond the original study team. Now, in recent years, we've seen the rise in different online repositories for data storage, which has made this much easier, and this practice has been growing. Some of the purported benefits of open data are that it can improve reliability of individual research studies. So that's because other people can check the analyses that have been done. There's an economic benefit because studies that are run, the data can be reused in the future, reducing the burden on participants. And there's also a moral argument as well, that much of the research that we do is publicly funded, and so the public and the people who benefit from research should have access to that data as well. However, there are some issues in how we might do this. So the current work was directly inspired by the fallout from the Spectrum 10K episode. So in brief detail, Spectrum 10K was a planned research study which aimed to collect physical mental health data plus DNA samples from 10,000 autistic people. So a number of ethical issues were identified with the study before it had launched, and this coalesced into an autistic-led protest movement, Boycott Spectrum 10K. So there are a number of issues about the study that have been raised, but what was relevant here was that the consent forms included this mandatory agreement for data sharing. What subsequently happened was the study was paused, and then earlier this year, it was cancelled. So this is really, I think, a landmark moment in community researcher relations, and there's a lot for us as a field to reflect on. And one thing that we as a team of autism researchers who are interested in open research practices considered was that this highlighted that open science and open research practices have been moving forward, but something that's often missing is the community's perspectives on these practices, and this applies in autism as well. So we interviewed 30 people about their perspectives. So we recruited autistic adults and also parents of autistic children as well. So we recruited both adults and parents, because parents also do make decisions about consent around data sharing on behalf of their children. We also considered that different demographic factors might shape different perspectives on open data. So we aim to recruit a diverse sample in terms of ethnicity and also in terms of how much research experience participants had. So to facilitate this, we recruited both through all the team's local participant databases, but also the UK charity Autistica also supported through their Discover network. So because not everyone spends a lot of time thinking about data sharing, we prepared a short video that we gave to participants before they took part. This just introduced what open data is, and talked a little bit about the different ways that data can be shared, because this really does exist on a bit of a continuum. So this goes from using online repositories that are fully open, like the Open Science Framework lots of people might be familiar with. There are also restricted access models of data sharing. So in the UK, we have the UK Data Service. And so restricted access just means that the person has to request to get hold of the data or some part of the data. And then there's fully closed, where researchers just keep the data to themselves. So participants completed an interview, a one-to-one, where we talked to them about their views, some of the positives and risks around data sharing, and what contextual factors shaped their perspectives. So we used thematic analysis to analyze the data, which is the kind of qualitative analysis which is interpretative. And because we were inspired by what happened with Spectrum 10K, the analysis that we used was really focused on trying to understand some of the power dynamics in what the participants said. So first, just as some general reflections across the data, we found that participants were actually really quite positive about the potential for autism research to improve their lives, and also saw open data as a tool which could really enhance the benefits of research. Participants did express a clear benefit that where they agreed to data being shared, they preferred the idea of open data with some sort of access restrictions. And so as illustrated by this quote here, the key part is that participants wanted somebody to have some insight into who was actually getting hold of the data that they'd contributed to that study. So we had, in our thematic analysis, there were two key themes. One was narratives of research, and the other was vulnerability and risk in research participation. And really cutting across these two themes we sort of have a cross-cutting theme of individuals versus communities, which is the different ways in which participants related to these themes, reflecting on their own individual, at the individual level, but also thinking of the wider autism community. Okay, so a major concern that participants had were around the narratives that can be constructed from research data. So participants generally reflected that they had this idea of data as something that's neutral, but really it's through the interpretations, which is where researchers exercise power. And really the concern here was that data that was being shared and being made openly available could become detached from the study that they had originally consented to take part in. They felt very disempowered in this process. And so in particular, they were worried that there was the potential for data that they contributed to a study with a particular a scope. This could potentially be reinterpreted, and this could feed into harmful narratives around autism. The second theme related to vulnerability and risks around open data. So the key risk that participants noted was the risks of re-identification from data that was being shared. Participants reflected on their vulnerability around these issues at different stages, so and relating to different characteristics. One thing just to note here is post-diagnosis was quite often raised. This is a time when people were really looking for as much information as they can, and they agreed to take part in studies and consented to lots of different things. But then later on in their journey reflected, oh, maybe I wouldn't have done that at this stage. And what's also really important to reflect on is that participants noted they felt very disempowered by limits to knowledge about what was happening when they agreed that data in a study could be shared. So this is given here by this quote that you read things like consent forms and participant information sheets, but you don't really understand the implications. So really it's notable that in these interviews where we were presenting these different models of ways in which data could be shared, and participants had space to reflect on the implications, many of them really changed their perspective across the course of the interview, having been very originally like, oh, just share everything. Okay, so sort of the key takeaways from this work. So I think it's important to note that participants were really positive about autism research. They were also really positive about the potential of open data and really saw how that could benefit research. But there are two key considerations here for researchers. One thing to note is that the participants' preference overall was that restricted access models were their preference for data sharing. So it's worth looking into services like the UK Data Service if you want to make data open for your study. And also, we really have a duty of care to participants as well. So consent forms really are currently not accessible and not really, participants aren't making informed consent. So this is something we really need to think about in our work. And just thinking of moving forwards with this, I think we can move towards more ethical open autism data practices. So something that we might look to in the future is how we might work in collaboration with the autistic community to co-produce suitably ethical open data processes, looking at how data might be managed and safeguarded with community oversight. I think there's also an important bit of space for more empirical meta-research as well. One reflection I had from this work was just thinking about whether those benefits that have been cited to having data shared, are they being realized in the field, but also in the risks that participants are raising around re-narrativization. Can we find an evidence base for the risks and benefits? And this can really help shape participant decision-making. So finally, I just really want to draw attention to, I'm the person who stood up here today presenting, but this really is a collaborative effort. Many of my co-researchers are here at the conference. We analysed the data collectively, and I think having that sort of the multi-perspective insight here was really valuable. And in particular, a shout out to Hannah Hobson, who is the PI of this work. The preprint is out now, so if you want to have a look at that, hopefully the QR code will take you there. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Now, time for questions. Please raise your hands. On the left, one question. Please, a short question.
Thank you. Well, I have a question about were there any differences between how the parents perceived open data compared to people with autism?
Yes, a good question, and it is something that we reflected on. That I can remember, I don't think there were any marked differences. It was something that we were maybe expecting that there would be there. Yeah, I think to be honest, I think we were maybe a little bit surprised by how participants, autistic participants, how positive they were about the prospect of data sharing and autism research, particularly at that moment in time. So yeah, that I can remember, there were no meaningful differences there. Thank you.
Another question.
Thank you, that was very interesting. Did you ask participants, or did anyone raise the issue of being recontacted about other future uses of data? And if so, was there any kind of consensus opinion around whether that was possible or desirable?
So participants being contacted themselves about whether the data should be reused. So that isn't something that I think anyone mentioned as a thing that happened to them. But in terms of that reflection on sort of models for data sharing that they could imagine, they did want to have that more continued oversight. And so there were different perspectives on whether that would be the individual themselves or that they would be handed over to some sort of representative who they trusted who could have that oversight. But that is definitely something that came up, although it doesn't feature in our data that we present, it's definitely something that came up in the interviews. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
1 minute for another question. So, one question. Do you have some tools to increase the power of control by participants about their data?
Do I have any what to increase the power?
How
Sorry.
they are used, because the process not always is transparent by who is using which data and for what.
Yeah, so that's, I guess, my point at the end is about where we could move towards that, looking at new models by which we can do this. So it's something I reflect on when you think about open research in general. A lot of the genesis of these practices really just come directly from social psychology. And so that where they've been applied, it's like perhaps appropriate for social psychology research, where a lot of the time it's populations where they might feel fairly ambivalent about their data being shared, although I don't think anyone's really asked them. And then it's now we're saying, okay, when we look at marginalized populations, that these approaches aren't suitable here, and so we actually need to just reimagine new ways of doing this. So I think it's something that we need to look at developing that don't really fit totally within current frameworks.